Okay.
So welcome. Welcome to this second online event of the Between Athens and Alexandria project. And it is very good to see you here again. So please keep your microphones off during the talk. We will be able to turn them on again for the discussion. This time there will be no handout, no share screen, but there will be a handout which will be distributed via the chat box. So ideally, please also keep the cameras on so that the speaker can see us. So this is our second online lecture, and I would like to say that we are very happy and immensely honored that our speaker today is Professor John Dillon, who is going to talk on intellect sober, intellect drunk, some reflections on the Plotinian Ascent narrative. Professor Dillon does not need any introduction. But custom has it that speakers are introduced. And as I am the one who has to introduce him, although I feel very humbled and I think I shouldn't say a word, I will try my best. So Professor Dillon is the man who has put Neoplatonic philosophy on the map of English speaking scholarship. Educated at Oxford and at the University of California at Berkeley, where he has been professor and chair of the Department of Classics. He is Regius Professor of Greek Emeritus at Trinity College, Dublin, where he has founded the Plato Center. He is a member of the Royal Irish Academy, as well as a corresponding member of the British Academy and of the Academy of Athens. His research focuses on the Platonic tradition from the Old Academy to the Renaissance, as well as on early Christianity. I must say that I have not had the honor of meeting him in person, but I have heard many miraculous stories, all of them very complimentary, from great friends and teachers of mine who are Professor Dillon's friends and students. And all of these stories are filled with admiration and gratitude and love, and they all tell about a great man and a great soul, a Hellenist, and at the same time a Platonic philosopher, a true Platonist, author and editor of more than 30 books, of hundreds of articles, and teacher to many students who have become teachers in their turn around the world. Professor Dillon is also a scholar of modern Irish letters, which is perhaps less known. He has studied and published on James Joyce Finnegan's Wake. He is a novelist himself. His novel, The Scent of Eucalyptus, being set in Africa. And this morning he mentioned to me that he is a lover of Cavafy. And I know that some 10 years ago, he delivered a talk, I think it was in Canada, named after Darrell, Alexandria Quartet, that is, unlike Darrell, Callimachos, Philo, Origen, and Cavafy. To my mind, his last non-academic book the lockdown papers is just another way in which he is present to both himself and to others, just like Plotinus. So I would like to thank him again for having accepted our invitation, and many apologies because no introduction by me could measure up to his work. So Professor Dillon, the floor is yours.
No, indeed, I really, that was a most generous and welcome introduction. I hardly deserve that. I'm very relieved to have been able to tune in here. I thought I was cut out at the last moment. Now, this paper, which is necessarily highly speculative, and which may well seem outrageous to many Plotinus admirers, of whom I would certainly count myself as one, is provoked on the one hand by discussions with colleagues in the field of neurology in Trinity College here, and on the other hand by the reading of two most stimulating books. The first, entitled A Smell of Burning by Colin Grant, which is a lively and learned account of the treatment of epilepsy down the ages, serving as a background to his experiences with his younger brother Christopher, who was afflicted with this condition. The second is a rather more controversial, but still most interesting one, entitled Proof of Heaven by the American neurologist Eben Alexander. Now, my particular focus of interest in this paper is to explore the following question. Might there be any excuse for postulating, not only in the case of Plotinus, but in any of those who one might term natural mystics, that the visions they experience of another realm of existence may result from a distinctive brain condition, specifically a condition of the temporal lobes, which, while not itself being a disease, has affinities or to aspects of the disease of epilepsy, notably the proneness of certain epileptics to experience visions or auras as preludes to a seizure. These visions typically involve the experience of bright light, which is regarded as benign and even lovable, with the sensation of being transported to some other realm of existence. What one experiences in that other realm is conditioned, not surprisingly, by the intellectual or religious traditions in which one has been brought up. For instance, those of the Christian faith might well experience visions of angels and saints, or even of Christ himself, or of his Blessed Mother. While Sufi mystics, let us say, or Buddhist ones would find themselves confronted with appropriate figures or scenarios from their cultural environment. Among such figures, Colin Grant, in a fine chapter of his book entitled Ticket for Heaven, gives good arguments for including Paul of Tarsus, Muhammad, Joan of Arc, and the novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky. All of these manifested some symptoms analogous to epilepsy, though without, except perhaps in the case of Dostoevsky, suffering from that disease in its normal or chronic form. There are records of similar phenomena being reported by those who have undergone near-death experiences. And that is what was experienced by the American surgeon, Dr. Eben Alexander, as a result of a bad case of bacterial meningitis, which almost killed him and had him in a medically induced coma for a full week in 2008. His background would seem to have been pretty firmly secular and materialist, so that his visions give off an aura rather of Disney World than of a Christian or Muslim heaven. But they are nonetheless interesting for that. What I would like to do here is to run through the chief features of this near-death experience of his, and then see how they relate to any hints that Plotinus may drop, in particular in the tractate 6-7, number 38 in the chronological list, how the multitude of the forms came into being, and on the good, but also elsewhere in the slightly earlier treatise 5.8, number 31, on intelligible beauty, as to the nature of his personal experiences. Alexander begins his spiritual adventure in a murky darkness, page 29 to 32 of his book. He seems to be surrounded by roots or blood vessels in a womb. He hears a grim rhythmic pounding. He feels that he no longer has a body and no memory of prior existence or of the passage of time. Then something impinges in the darkness, something radiating filaments of white gold light, which at the same time emits a new sound, as he says, a living sound, like the richest, most complex, most beautiful piece of music you've ever heard. This in place of the previous mechanical pounding associated with the darkness. And this is the first extract on your handout, which I hope is available. Then at the very center of the light, he says, something else appeared, an opening. I was no longer looking at the slowly spinning light at all, but through it. The moment I understood this, I began to move up fast. There was a whooshing sound, and in a flash I went through the opening and found myself in a completely new world, the strangest, most beautiful world I'd ever seen. Now, so far, the analogy to this account is not so much anything in Plotinus' work, but rather the allegory of the cave in Plato's Republic, where you have the same opening that you don't swoosh through, but you go through. Though admittedly life in the cave-like dwelling is a good deal more structured than in Eben Alexander's primeval dark, which is more reminiscent indeed of the barbaric ooze, the barbarikos, which in the eye of the soul, in which the eye of the soul is described as being sunk in Republic Book 7, 533 D1. But the emerging of the released prisoner into the light of the real world, and then his ultimate contemplation of the sun itself, as well, of course, as these certain features of the myth of in Book 10 of the same dialogue, does accord with the general pattern of recorded near-death experiences, and provokes one to wonder whether Plato himself may not have enjoyed some quantum of mystical experience. However, that is, by the way, we are concerned here with Plotinus. Before we turn to consider what he is prepared to let slip for us, though, we must allow Eben Alexander to finish his story. I select out only features of his rather ecstatic narrative that seem to me to have some particular relevance to Plotinus' characterization of the intelligible realm, specifically concerning interpenetration of all the objects of that realm, and even the lack of distinction between subject and object of perception. In chapter 9, then, pages 45 to 6, we find the following. This is your second extract. Seeing and hearing were not separate in this place where I now was. I could hear the visual beauty of the silvery bodies of those scintillating beings above, and I could see the surging, joyful perfection of what they sang. It seemed that you could not look at it or listen to anything in this world without becoming a part of it, without joining with it in some mysterious way. Again, from my present perspective, I would suggest that you couldn't look at anything in that world at all, for the word "at" implies a separation that did not exist there. Everything was distinct, yet everything was also a part of everything else, like the rich and intermingled designs on a Persian carpet or a butterfly's wing. Now, I find this most significant from a man who can have no inkling of the philosophy of Plotinus, or of his attempts to convey the quality of the intelligible realm. Let us recall in this connection just two notable passages from Ennead 6:7. First, the image that closes chapter 12, where he's trying to describe a situation where all things are filled full of life, and we may say boiling with life. And this is your third extract. They all flow in a way from a single spring, not like one particular breath or one warmth, but as if there were one quality which held and kept intact all the qualities in itself, of sweetness along with fragrance, and was once the quality of wine and the character of all tastes, the sights of colors, and all the awareness of touch, and all that hearings hear, all tunes and every rhythm. This is Hilary Armstrong's translation. And then the remarkable passage from chapter 15, a little later, lines 25 following, where he is trying to describe the complexity involved in the vision of the bright life of the intelligible realm, which he contrasts with the darkness, the skotos here below. And so if one likens it to a living, richly varied sphere, or imagines it as a thing all faces, that's a lovely description, I think, pamprosopontichrema, shining with living faces, a face full of faces. Or as all the pure souls running together into the same place with no deficiencies, but having all that is their own, and universal intellect sitting on their summits, so that the region is illuminated by intellectual light. If one imagined it like this, one would be seeing it somehow as one sees another from outside. But one must become that and make oneself the contemplation. Keeps insisting on that. You're not looking at these things, you're in them. Here it seems to me that Plotinus is attempting to give a coherent account, compatible with his Platonist philosophical education, of an experience very similar to that of Eben Alexander, who is himself representative of many attested near-death experiences. All the objects of one's experience seem to blend together in a timeless environment, and one feels oneself to be somehow united with those objects. But this is not the end or the summit of the adventure. Alexander now approaches a level of being which he calls the core. And this is your extract 5. I continued moving forward and found myself entering an immense void, completely dark, infinite in size, and yet also infinitely comforting. Pitch black as it was also brimming with light. A light that seemed to come from a brilliant orb that I now sensed near me, an orb that was living and almost solid. He describes himself as feeling somehow like a fetus in a womb, floating and nourished by an invisible mother. In this case, the mother was God, the creator, the source who was responsible for making the universe and all in it. This being was so close, there seemed to be no distance at all between God and myself. Yet at the same time, I could sense the infinite vastness of the creator, could see how completely minuscule I was by comparison. He now proposes to denominate this ultimate being Om, and we may humor him in that. What I find particularly interesting in this passage, however, is that his testimony that he finds Om both intimately close and remotely vast. This surely accords well with Plotinus' testimony, for instance, in Ennead 5, 3, 14, and 17, or 6, 7, 36, which we'll get to, that the one is both near, indeed within us, and infinitely remote. The other remarkable sensation that he experiences, which seems to me to relate significantly to an important aspect of Plotinus' view of both the intellectual realm and the one itself, is that of both the lovingness and the lovability of this supreme being. In pages 70 to 1, he reveals a basic intuition that he acquired from his contact with the one. This is your section 6, It came in 3 parts. And to take one more shot at putting it into words, because of course it was initially delivered wordlessly, it would run something like this. You are loved and cherished. You have nothing to fear. There is nothing you can do wrong. That's pretty optimistic. If I had to boil this entire message down to one sentence, it would run this way. You are loved. And if I had to boil it down further to just one word, it would, of course, be simply love. Love is without a doubt the basis of everything. Not some abstract, hard-to-fathom kind of love, but the day-to-day kind that everyone knows, the kind of love we feel when we look at our spouse and our children, or even our animals. In its purest and most powerful form, this love is not jealous or selfish, but unconditional. This is the reality of realities, the incomprehensibly glorious truth of truths that breathes at the core of everything that exists or that ever will exist. And no remotely accurate understanding of who and what we are can be achieved by anyone who does not know it and embody it in all their activity. Now, this may all come across as absurdly effusive and sentimental, but I think we must give it due attention as an admittedly amateurish version of a truth into which a long succession of serious mystics down the ages, not least Plotinus, have gained insight. Namely, that there is at the core of the universe an entity or force that is both enormously attractive or lovable, and which itself radiates love for its creation, which may indeed be the reason for its profound attraction. If we turn to the later chapters of Enneads 6-7, we can, I think, see some significant evidence of this. The question that arises from chapter 18 onwards is why the intelligible world is so beautiful, so attractive. After all, mere perfection of form and structure does not necessarily generate attractiveness, Plotinus argues. The answer develops over the next few chapters, but the essence of it, stated at the outset, is that it is infused with the good, giving that interpretation to the adjective agathoides, which has to be unpacked a little in this context, I think. It's rather difficult to render it adequately in this context. That involves being suffused with a sort of spiritual light and beauty emanating from a source higher than itself. The characterization of this comes to a head in chapter 22. That is your extract 7. When anyone therefore sees this light, then truly he is also moved to the forms and longs for the light that plays upon them and delights in it. Glykomenos elphrenedai. Just as with the bodies here below, our desire is not for underlying material things, but for the beauty imaged upon them. For each is what it is by itself, but it becomes desirable when the good colors it, giving a kind of grace to them and a passionate love to the desirers. Then the soul, receiving into itself an outflow from thence, is moved and dances wildly and is all stung with longing and becomes love. Before this, it is not moved even towards intellect, for all its beauty. The beauty of intellect is inactive, argon, till it catches a light from the good. And the soul by itself falls flat on its back and is completely inactive. It's a little quotation from the Phaedrus, misused, interestingly. And is completely inactive. And though intellect is present, is unenthusiastic about it. But when a kind of warmth, theramosia, from thence comes upon it, it gains strength and wakens and is truly winged. And though it is moved with passion for that which lies close by it, yet all the same it rises higher to something greater, which it seems to remember. and as long as there is anything higher than that which is present to it, it naturally goes on upwards, lifted by the giver of its love. As Armstrong notes apropos this last phrase, this is the clearest statement by Plotinus of something implicit in his whole system, that our desire to return to the good is given by the good. But this whole passage, I think, when read against the background of Alexander's testimony, gives evidence of the degree of personal experience informing Plotinus's concept of the good, both of the love that it emanates and the love in return that it inspires. It's interesting that Alexander wishes to characterize the ultimate principle, that which is in some way beyond the timeless but structured world of interpenetrating essences, as both completely dark but also brimming over with light, infinite in size, but with no discernible features, but at the same time infinitely comforting. It's something like this, it seems to me, that Plotinus is making a heroic effort to describe in chapters 35 to 6 of 6-7, to some features of which I wish now to draw our attention. Let us look first at the beginning of chapter 35, noting how in the approach to the one, the soul actually transcends intellection, while of course retaining some mode of immediate apprehension. Plotinus is always very concerned to deny that the one is unintellectual or has no feeling at all. It's just that it's above intellect. This is your section 8. And the soul is so disposed then as even to despise intelligence, which at other times it welcomed. Because intelligence, nous noesis, is a kind of movement, and the soul does not want to move. For it says that he whom it sees does not move either. Yet when this soul has become intellect, it contemplates, when it has been, so to speak, made intellect, oionotheisa, and has come to be in the intelligible place. But when it has come to be in it and moves about in it, it possesses the intelligible and thinks. But when it sees that God, it at once lets everything go. Pantaphies. We are now treated to the image of one entering a fine mansion. So it is one of Plotinus' famous images, and admiring all the furniture and ornaments. But when at last the master of the house appears, forgetting all about the fine fittings and focusing solely on him. Furthermore, as it emerges, the vision of the master of the house has a curious quality. And this is your extract number 9. And then as he looks and does not take his eyes away, by the continuity of his contemplation, he no longer sees a sight, but mingles his seeing with what he contemplates, so that what was seen before has now become sight in him, and he forgets all other objects of contemplation. And perhaps the image would better preserve the analogy, if it were not a mortal who encountered the viewer of the contents of the house, but one of the gods, and one who did not appear visibly, but filled the soul of the beholder. Here, in the best tradition of Plotinian dynamic imagery, the master of the house first transformed from a human into a god, and then somehow blended with the beholder. We may recall here the testimony of Eben Alexander that the being which he encountered was so close that there seemed to be no distance at all between God and myself. And this is an experience testified to by many mystics down the ages, while still having the sensation that God is enormously superior and remote. Plotinus now goes on to make the well-known distinction which inspires the title of this paper, section 10 in your handout. Intellect also then has one power for thinking, by which it looks at the things in itself, and one by which it looks at what transcends it by a direct awareness and reception, epiboleetine kai paradoxe, by which also before it saw only, and by seeing acquired intellect and is one. And that first one is the contemplation of intellect in its right mind. But the other is intellect in love, when it goes out of its mind, drunk with the nectar. Then it falls in love, simplified into happiness by having its fill. Haplothes is eupatheia, whatever that really means. It could be unfolded, it could be into eupatheia, to koro. It is better for it to be drunk with a drunkenness like this than to be more respectably sober. Well, the significant evocation of the myth of Poros and Penia from the Symposium, 203 BC, is actually being used rather inappropriately, as Poros in the myth did not gain any vision of super-intellectual reality through becoming drunk. He simply left himself open to seduction by Penia. But no matter, it would not be by any means the only creative misappropriation of a myth, Platonic or traditional, perpetrated by Plotinus. What is significant here is the connection of drunkenness in the sense of a special supra-rational state of intellect and love, both the feeling of love for a special kind of object and the sensation that one is oneself suffused by the love emanating from that object, which is attested to by Alexander, and once again by a long succession of mystics in various ages and cultures. Plainly, Plotinus is here conveying to us a personal experience, which he's seeking to fit into the structure of the Platonist universe. For the rest of chapter 35 and the whole of 36, he's concerned to attempt to specify the peculiar quality of our apprehension of the supra-intellectual first principle, the one or the good. Sorry, line 34 following, he produces the following, or section 11. But the soul sees by a kind of confusing and annulling the intellect which abides within it. Or rather, its intellect sees first, but then the vision actually enters into it, and the two become one. But the good is spread out over them and fitted into the union of both, playing upon them and uniting the two. It rests upon them and gives a blessed perception and vision, lifting them so high as not to be in place at all, nor in anything other among things where it is natural for one thing to be in another. For he is not, we note by the way that Plotinus keeps changing from the neuter to the masculine when talking about the first principle, which is properly neuter, agathon, to hen. But he's thinking of it as theos. For he is not anywhere either. The intelligible place is in him, but he is not in anything else. We see here Plotinus valiantly striving to characterize the peculiar mode of apprehension proper to intellect in relation to the first principle, or good. In the following chapter, 36, we find him expanding on this somewhat further, lines 10 following. That's your extract 12. But whoever has become at once contemplator of himself and everything else, and object of his own contemplation, theates te kai theama, autos autou. And since he has become substance, ousia, and intellect, and the complete living being, reference to Timaeus, no longer looks at it from outside. When he has become this, he is near engus, and the good is next above him, ephexis, and already close by, shining upon all the intelligible world. This in turn is followed by a remarkable passage in which he describes how first one abandons or transcends all study and learning, and then is lifted up on high by a kind of swell or wave, uspercumity, and sees suddenly, exeifnes, not seeing how. And the vision fills his eyes with light and does not make him see something else by it, but the light itself is what he sees. This is all eerily reminiscent of the testimony of Eben Alexander, that the being with whom he was confronted was so close that there seemed to be no distance at all between God and myself, and that it was brimming with light. I feel that all this indicates pretty clearly that the basis of Plotinus's account of the structure of the noetic and supranoetic world is personal experience. My final question is whether there is any evidence that in order to attain these insights, Plotinus resorted to any ritualistic practices, analogous to those copiously attested in other mystical traditions, such as the Buddhist or Islamic ones. This is something that Plotinus is not at all inclined to be specific about. But it seems to me that in the same chapter of 6-7, he does rather coyly suggest that he has an adequate supply of these. Now, it is important that even by later Platonists, Plotinus and Porphyry were regarded as purely philosophers, as opposed to Iamblichus and his followers who would be more theurgists and so on. And Iamblichus indeed attacks Porphyry for thinking he can get to the highest level without theurgy. But it doesn't say that you eschew all spiritual exercises. And I think he does not. Anyway, at line 7 of the chapter, we find the following. We are taught about it, as Plato's greatest study, Megas Anathema, by analogies and negations and knowledge of the things which come from it. This is your section 13. And certain methods of ascent by degrees. But we are put on the way to it by purifications and virtues and adornings. Catharsis, kai aratai, strange use of the word, kai cosmesis. And by gaining footholds, epibasis, in the intelligible, and setting ourselves firmly, hydruses, there, and feasting, hestiasis, on its contents. This last presumably a reference to the Phaedrus myth, 247e2, where they all stop and feast at the end of their heavenly ride. The earlier list here corresponds to the various dialectical methods of ascent to the first principle, outlined, for instance, by Alcinous in his Didascalikos, chapter 10, Analogia, Aphiresis, and Hyperarche, and thus tested for the earlier Platonist tradition. I am particularly interested, however, in the catharsis, the aratai, and the cosmesis. What practices might be concealed behind these terms? Under the heading of purifications, I suppose one might include ascetic dietary practices, such as are attested in chapter 2 of Porphyry's life. But really all that Porphyry tells us is that Plotinus observed a strictly vegetarian diet, and no doubt he was frugal with that, and avoided baths. Under the heading of virtues, one might perhaps include the systematic ascent through the levels of virtue envisaged in Ennead 1-2, where one may ascend from the civic level of virtue to the purificatory level, and then to the paradigms of the virtues residing at the level of intellect, at the end of the treatise, chapter 7. Attainment of this paradigmatic level of virtue effectively makes us gods. For it is to them, says Plotinus, and not to good men, that we are to liken ourselves. This process of ascent, which inevitably involves meditative practices of some sort, is attested for Plotinus most interestingly by Porphyry in a later section of the life, chapter 23, where he is conducting an exegesis of the oracles from Delphi commissioned by Amelius. That's your section 14. So to this godlike man above all, who often raised himself in thought, according to the ways Plato teaches us in the Symposium, to the first and transcendent God, eston proton ka epikenatheon, that God appeared who has neither shape nor any intelligible form. but is throned above intellect and all the intelligible. Porphyry goes on rather coyly again to attest that he himself, on at least one occasion, drew near to this God, while asserting that Plotinus achieved the union 4 times, while I was with him, in an unspeakable actuality, and not in potency only. I've often wondered rather irreverently how these occasions were recorded. Did the great man perhaps emerge from his study with a beatific smile on his face and announce, "I've done it again"? Or might it be the case rather on 4 occasions that Porphyry finds him prostrate on the floor of his study, and on rousing him learns that that is where he's been? We will never know. But surely something remarkable happened that leads Porphyry to make this claim. Because I think Plotinus frequently ascended to the level of nous. No problem there. Furthermore, Porphyry records, quoting the oracle, that the gods often set him straight when he was going on a crooked course, sending down a solid shaft of light, which means that he wrote what he wrote under their inspection and supervision. I find it most interesting that it's actually Apollo, through his oracle, that attests to all this. Perhaps we might give some credence to the suggestion that Emilius, who ordered the oracle, in fact marked the cards of the Delphic priests rather thoroughly when putting in his order. At any rate, to return for a moment to the question of possible aids to mystical vision, apart from the exercises based on Diotima's ladder, I would suggest, that's in the symposium of course, I would suggest the consideration of a number of Plotinus's dynamic images, such as, for instance, the striking one at 512 of soul lighting up the physical universe. First, all is darkness, then light pours in, illuminating all the features of the globe. Or better, 589, where we're exhorted to call to mind the whole physical universe, and then think away its spatial extension. That's no easy task. Don't just shrink it. Calling on God to assist us in this. It is surely spiritual exercises such as this that Plotinus employs to bring on mystical insights in the form of ascent to the noetic world. But if so, he's certainly not going to tell us. As for the third category of aids, cosmeses, I can only suggest that in the sense of structurings or orderings, rather than adornments of the soul, Plotinus might in fact be referring to the spiritual exercises just mentioned. Plato, I note, uses the term in the Gorgias, 504d2, to denote the qualities of soul that make men orderly and law-abiding, which is not too far away from the meaning suggested here. With that, then, I rest my case. My suggestion is that Plotinus, like many another remarkable figure in human history, such as St. Paul, Muhammad, Joan of Arc, Teresa of Avila, or Fyodor Dostoevsky, was endowed, rather than afflicted, with a disorder, in inverted commas, of the temporal lobes of the brain, which enabled him to access other realms of reality. And since his training was in the Platonist philosophical tradition, he strove to fit the mystical insights with which he was blessed into the framework of that tradition. This he did in general with great dexterity, though retaining a few distinctive features of which he's himself conscious, such as the postulation of that aspect of the human soul which remains above in the noetic world. A conviction which stems, I think, directly from his personal experience. I mean, I think when he ascended, he found that he was in some way there already, and which he's not prepared to surrender, despite its interference with the general distinction he wishes to draw, for dogmatic reasons, between the levels of intellect and soul. I mean, this that remains above can't really be soul, any part of the soul. In conclusion, I'd like to quote a passage from that great chronicler of mysticism, Evelyn Underhill, from her book Mysticism, a study of the nature and development of man's spiritual consciousness. Page 24. It's your last extract. In mysticism, that love of truth which we saw as the beginning of all philosophy leaves the merely intellectual sphere and takes on the assured aspect of a personal passion. Where the philosopher guesses and argues, the mystic lives and looks, and speaks consequently the disconcerting language of first-hand experience, not the neat dialectic of the schools. Hence, while the absolute of the metaphysicians remains a diagram, impersonal and unattainable, the absolute of the mystics is lovable, attainable, alive. Now, Plotinus is undoubtedly a first-rate philosopher in the Platonist tradition, but I think it's undeniable that he's also, and perhaps primarily, a mystic, though one who is at every stage concerned to structure his mystical insights within the framework of his philosophy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this uplifting talk. We have plenty of time for discussion. So if you have a question, I would please ask that you use the chat. A simple Q would be enough, and this would allow me to keep the order. Otherwise, you can also raise hands, but in that case, I may not be able to keep the exact order. So it is either way, but the chat is perhaps better. Yes, okay. So Professor Altman, please.
Well, thank you very much, John, for that extremely interesting and amusing paper. I was completely delighted by it. My question is going to ask you to put yourself in the position of somebody that would be absolutely outraged by your paper, and I'm quite certain that you're tolerably aware with what that outrage might look like. And so I would like you, in putting yourself in that position, to reflect on Plato's well-known distinction about lying. In other words, that to say the false thing unknowingly is actually worse than to say the false thing knowingly, because at least the knowing liar has knowledge, whereas the liar that doesn't know obviously is captive of ignorance. And so with this distinction in mind, and asking you to answer as somebody that would be outraged by your paper, in other words, a true Plotinian Kool-Aid drinker that will tolerate absolutely no criticism of the master, not even of the type that you stuck in several times by using the way that he misused passages from the Symposium or Phaedrus, which I very much appreciated. But anyway, I loved your paper. But so here's my question. Let's assume that Dillon is right, and that these descriptions of his experiences are in fact caused by something physiological of the type that you've described. Which do you think would outrage which would be more acceptable to a Plotinian that was outraged by your paper? If Plotinus was ignorant, that these experiences had a physiological basis that called into question their eternal, universal, and Platonic validity, or if he did know. I mean, in other words, which would actually outrage a Plotinian worse, a Plotinian more, in your opinion, if he did know that these had a physiological basis, or there actually being a physiological basis he did not know? Which would be more objectionable in your view to a Plotinian?
Oh, yes, Bill, that is certainly that's a nice puzzle. I mean, if you are a sort of person for whom these experiences would be in the case of Plato or Plotinus, a deep embarrassment, then the kindest thing would be to suppose that Plotinus was deluded. But people who are not quite prepared to accept that Plotinus, that there's this uncanny aspect to Plotinus, or I would say that it's the feeling that he's been there, had better not mess with him at all, because it'll just they will get depressed. Now the question is I started this inquiry because it's funny, we were having a little colloquium which has to continue later in the year now in Trinity about the phenomenon of cosmic ascent, which one of my students is concerned with. And in that connection, we were consulting neurologist colleagues. And I became interested in this idea and came upon these books, especially the one of Grant that I mentioned, that all right, you could say some people may have a condition of the temporal lobes. Now, that doesn't mean that they're being deluded. I think it would generally assume, oh, that he just has something wrong with his head. No, it may be a great privilege that this enables you to break through to another level of existence. This is not the sort of thing that is going to appeal to the average logical positivist, Oxbridge, Anglo-American philosopher, but that's too bad. That's too bad. They shouldn't mess with Plotinus. I'm trying to analyze what interests me, in the case of Plato as well, that not that the opposition between mystic and philosopher is misjudged. I mean, a mystic in the sort of comic book version is somebody who totally transcends all reason. I think the interesting thing about Plotinus is that he wants to fit what he knows he's experienced into a respectable Platonist universe. And I think he does. I think the only odd bit, and he recognizes it's a bit odd, is the part of the soul that does not descend. Now, why he's quite fixed on that. I think because it represents an experience he has. He tries to fit that in reasonably, but it's a funny object. It has to be a sort of individual form. It has to be a form of an individual. If you think about it, it can't be a bit of soul, really. But apart from that, he sorts out the one, intellect, soul, and nature, and so on, and gives a perfectly philosophical account of these things. So have I answered that question? I've sort of gone off. I mean, I would want to assert that, even suggesting that that Plotinus had a brain condition, you're not accusing him of lying unwittingly, unless you absolutely do not believe that there is another realm of existence. So obviously, if there isn't, and you're quite convinced of that, then he's obviously being deluded. It's not so obvious to me that there isn't. I wish I could get there, but I've been privileged in this way. All I can do is talk about it. But there we are.
Well, I love the image of the two different scenarios, of one with him flat on his back and the other of him emerging from his office with a beatific smile. That was beautiful. Thank you very much for your answer, John, and for your paper.
Dennis Clark.
Right.
Hello, can you hear me?
Dennis, yes.
Hello,
Good to see you.
Mr. Dillon, how are you? Bear with me a little bit here. This is a bit complex. I don't want to take up too much time. Are you familiar with entoptic phenomena?
Entoptic.
Yes.
They sound interesting.
And the work of an archaeologist from South Africa named David Lewis Williams.
Uh-huh.
And this gets a bit complicated, but how to sum this up? He wrote two books, one called The Mind in the Cave, which is about the Paleolithic, and he's a rock art expert, and he's just brilliant, I think. And the main thesis he comes up with there, and he's working with somebody else, I think. This is about, I don't know, maybe the last 20 years, that shamans experience in one way or another these entoptic phenomena, which actually anybody can have, which they're geometrical forms that the eye sees under certain conditions. And of course, sometimes it may be brought on by the use of hallucinogens, but not necessarily. I'll get to that in a minute. But the point is, it's a three-stage sort of mental system where it allows the shaman or anybody else really to go inside the brain to become, very much the kind of experience we're talking about here. Now, this definitely exists. I don't know that his theory has been completely accepted among archaeologists, but the book Mind in the Cave, he goes through all this. I was impressed. It's been a while since I read it. And then I experienced them myself. I'm not making this up, it's true. And what I saw were tetrahedrons, and it's a very bizarre experience. But what's interesting, before it happened to me again last fall, and it was many years back, about 10 years ago. What you see first, I know this is going to sound weird, is light.
Good.
You get this light. I got this light in my eyes, and it just happens.
Yeah.
Now, I've been to my ophthalmologist about this, and ophthalmologists say there's nothing wrong with it. But I don't think they really understand it. They make a distinction of entoptic being purely physiological within the eye, which I don't quite buy, versus what Williams is talking about is, it's a physiological thing, but it's mostly in the brain. I don't understand why the ophthalmologist making a distinction between the brain and the eye that much, but and I didn't find that my ophthalmologist really seemed two different ones understood quite what I was saying, because it was so it's geometric. I mean, I thought it was interesting. I was seeing tetrahedrons. I mean, is that Platonic or not?
Right.
So anyway, I would suggest I can send you the information.
Yes.
But it's curious. I don't know that I'm not saying that Plotinus was seeing entoptic phenomena either, but it's I find it interesting as a geometrical thing, and that obviously geometry is very important. We know, right, to Plotinus, and it is a kind of way of purifying, removing yourself, getting closer. I know now I'm beginning to sound like Amblicus in the DCMS, aren't I?
Yeah.
Anyway, I thought you might find that. I'll send you the information.
I'd be most interested in that. Yeah. I mean, I think with the tetrahedrons, what you see can be conditioned by what you expect to see. As I say, if one has a certain religious environment, you might see angels. Also, Eben Alexander had a spiritual companion who was a beautiful girl, floating with wings and so on. It was all a bit, as I say, Disney World stuff, but he had and again, that can reflect something, having one's personal daimon conducting one.
Well, in the book, he talks about, I think, so long as I read it, that often they would see animal shapes that would transform into, and we're talking about the Paleolithic here. So,
well, you see, the other thing very interesting about the foundations of religion in general, I think, it could be reasonably traced back to shamans who have been smoking something or ingesting something,
Right.
as they did. I mean, in Berkeley in my day, there was quite a lot of LSD going about, and of course we were into Carlos Castaneda and his peyote. That only got him flying. He didn't go to another realm of existence, but he flew about and he got insights into things. But LSD or various such things would bring on extraordinary visions. I remember being at a party once where one of the guests was a bit late. He had been driving across the Bay Bridge, and he halfway across, Jesus Christ appeared to him on the bonnet of the car, and the trouble was that Jesus' robes were flowing out. He couldn't see, so he had to stop and let Jesus off. And he got off and he drove on, but he'd been onto something. I think just pot. But,
well, I've had problems on the Bay Bridge for going to Berkeley, but never.
Oh, well, there we are. He was on but he got there anyway. But those sort of things could happen. But I think one could. I wouldn't want to suggest that Plotty was assisted by mushrooms or anything of that sort. He could do it naturally with a little.
Well, I didn't. It happened to me, and I wasn't taking anything either. But I don't know. I did have retinal problems, but the doctor never really convinced me that that's why it happened. And if you look up, I don't know. I don't think this has been. Maybe it's been studied. You really have to be an ophthalmologist, but I just think this is an interesting area that it's. You can look online also, but I think though that their book is. I'll send information because their book is very well. I mean, they're completely reputable scientists. I think he's brilliant. It's a beautifully written book too, and of course it goes very much into the origins of religion. Then he wrote another one called The Mind and the Neolithic Mind, which I don't think I ever finished. Anyway, thanks for the talk. It was wonderful.
Well, that's good to see you.
Good to see you.
Professor Shepard.
Yes, thank you for the talk, John. That was very enjoyable. I mean, I think what interests me in all of this is what you drew attention to, the fact that different people's interpretations of their experiences is very much affected by their belief system. And I mean, I thought the parallel between Plotinus and Eben Alexander was really interesting. But then it seems to me that I thought that when you get to your passages 6 and 7, it kind of comes apart, because although they're both talking about love, Eben Alexander is having some kind of experience, as you said, a rather sentimental experience of love coming from whatever it is that he feels he's in contact with. Whereas in Plotinus, the emphasis is all on the love going from the soul that's ascending towards the good. And I mean, I think you said Eben Alexander has a secular background, but you know, as somebody who's grown up in a society heavily influenced by Christianity, I take it that's where the idea about love comes from. So I didn't think that passages 6 and 7 were really as close together as you were suggesting.
Well, to make a very good point, I think that the love, I mean, Eben Alexander, I think is valuable precisely because he seems to be totally free of philosophical background. He was a neurosurgeon himself, but he would, of course, be coming from this Christian background that we are all loved by God. If you're a Platonist, you don't have that particular illusion. The one radiates a sort of love, and there's an interesting passage which we were just reading in the Cambridge group, Douglas Headley's group, in 6-8. 16, where suddenly Plotinus talks about God as Erasmios and Eros and love. I think I quoted in a footnote. But I mean, in a way, the one loves itself, if anything. I think it sort of, something radiates out from it, but one doesn't have the delightful sort of illusion, I suppose, that Christianity has, although it comes with a lot of reservations, that God loves you personally. I mean, I think all that Plotinus in 6-7 seems to be asking is, why is the intelligible world so lovable or so beautiful? He seems to suggest that it's radiated on by the one, and some sort of love there, but it's not personal love, no. And that's what gently Eben Alexander has this great illusion that he is personally loved and unconditionally, he can do what he likes.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, it's there's the lack of the personal aspect. Yeah, I think we're agreeing with each other. Thank you.
Paul Solmeyer, if I am pronouncing it correctly.
Very good. Thank you. Professor Dillon, thank you for your paper. It was an intriguing paper, well thought out, nicely argued. I have a question of interpretation, though, regarding Plotinus. For those of us who haven't experienced epilepsy or any of the symptoms that fall short of epilepsy, what would be the implications for interpreting Plotinus? Would there be a barrier there that we can't get through in our interpretation?
Well, as someone who hasn't ascended to even the intelligible world in the way that I think he did, never mind the one, I feel a bit deprived. But the thing is, I think, and it comes out in, I think someone like Dostoevsky is a kind of marginal figure. But St. Paul may have had the problem too, that these auras that the epileptic is gifted with are very like, in various ways, the visions that mystics can acquire, but without the unfortunate aspects of the disease. There's no suggestion that Plotinus suffered from fits or anything of that sort. So my suggestion, I was sort of trying it out on the neurological colleagues. Can we envisage a state of the temporal lobes or whatever, which is akin to the experience of epileptics, but is not, well, it's not a disease, or it doesn't preclude the fact that that you might be through to something, in fact, and not be suffering from a total illusion, because the experiences of near death, well, of those who have actually died technically and then are called back to life, are very similar to this. And there's a good book that's collected these stories. And I knew a chap in Berkeley who we did a seminar together on one thing on near-death experiences and illusion, well, notions of previous existence on. And he was a psychiatrist who dealt with the dying. And he said he'd come upon a number of people who'd had this sort of experience and were in many cases extremely annoyed to be called back to life. They were in a far better place. He found that most interesting. But there seemed to be something there that the brain can break through into this world, perhaps, or it can be afflicted. with visions which are akin to that. And I like to think that both possibilities exist.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if that was your question.
No, I think you answered it. There are other possibilities besides being afflicted with epilepsy or near-death experiences.
Yeah, because obviously the people who've suffered no near-death experiences do not, in general, have epilepsy, but they have some extremely troublesome disease, as did Eben Alexander, but he had I've forgotten what it was, but it wasn't epilepsy.
But now the question still remains, without a near-death experience or epilepsy, how close can a normal person come to a mystical experience?
Well, I can only suggest, I think that if one's not gifted that way, it's pretty tough, but that it can be achieved by, as the Buddhist monks and Sufis and so on appreciate by rigorous spiritual exercises and meditation on certain objects and chanting and trying to put yourself into a non-normal state of mind. It can be done. I think that the people who do that probably are that way inclined anyway, but I can see a distinction between people who can do that at the drop of a hat, more or less, and people who have to work at it. And generally one has to work at it. And even in Plotinus's case, I suggest that although he's not going to talk about that, he probably used certain meditative techniques to help things along. But he's not going to tell us.
Okay, thanks very much. I see I have to go teach a class in 13 minutes. So
Oh, yeah, right.
Thanks again for your talk. I appreciate it.
Yeah, could be the case, yeah.
Sebastian Maro Tornese, please.
Well, hello, thank you very much, Professor Dillon, for your talk. And my question is about love, also in the context of Plotinus Ennead 354, also because love in that Ennead is defined as an energeia of the soul, is an activity of the soul. So in a way, when the ascent of the soul is depicted as making the soul more intellective, in a way, there is another aspect of making the nous more like the soul, like when the nous is intoxicated, or the nous in love is more like the soul, because the soul is has this essence of longing. So my question is, who is uniting with the one in the nous or the one in the soul?
Yes. It's a nice point today. I mean, and Plotinus doesn't get very specific about it. I mean, he talks in this famous passage in 36, 6-7 of nous relating to the one. So but then soul relates to nous, you'd think. But the way he's expressing it is intellect sober and intellect drunk. Intellect sober will get you, well, one's personal intellect, if sober, will get you to intellect. But it has to get into a non-normal state to go beyond that. But by that time, he's talking about nous. And especially if one assumes that this non-descended part of the soul is actually a nous that relates to us, then it's that is ascending, I think. But he's fairly unspecific about, I mean, he talks about this soul, bit of soul that doesn't descend. And I just say, look, that's a very peculiar entity. but when it's when he's getting to the towards the one, he talks of his nous drunk and nous sober, and yet the soul is there. Well, being activated. I think the boundaries at the top end between soul and intellect are a bit fuzzy in his mind, if one may venture to say that.
Yes, yes, thank you.
You raise an interesting point.
Yeah. Oh, because it's sometimes interesting that the soul seems to be more like a whole, and sometimes the nous is like the eye of the soul, but the soul in a way seems to be.
Yes, and one talks about it. Even later Platonists, he doesn't, but Iamblichus and others talk about the one of the soul.
Yeah.
There's an aspect of the soul which is supra-rational, and it sort of connects with the one. So we can put that in our pipe and smoke it. The one of the soul. And I mean, Iamblichus, who postulates that, criticizes Plotinus for this concept of the non-descended soul. So,
thank you very much.
So I would have a question now. So I'm wondering whether you would see a connection between your passage number 11, and Porphyry's Life of Plotinus, chapter 15, where we are said that Porphyry wrote a poem, Ieros Gamos, which he read, and Plotinus said, you have revealed the poet and the philosopher and the hierophant. We don't know what the poem was about,
yes.
but could it have been, could it have related to union to the one, with the one?
That's a very nice question. I think it must have, almost, because I mean, the critics of it suggested that Porphyry had more or less gone round the bend or off his head. And why would they say that? He must have made some fairly ecstatic remarks, I think. And Plotinus would have picked up, would have felt that he knew what he was talking about. Yeah. That is interesting. I hadn't sort of thought of that little story, because Porphyry doesn't want to expand on it himself, but he must have been, well, describing or sort of envisaging in some way ecstatic experiences. Yeah, I think so. That's a good point.
Yes, thank you. But I think that the vocabulary of passage 11 points to some kind of Ieros Gamos.
Yeah, that's a good point. Using the knowing. Yes, the vision actually enters into it, and the two become one.
Yes.
Yes, right. Right. And the good is spread out over them, rests upon them, and gives them a blessed perception and vision. Yes, there'll be a sort of hieros gamos. Yeah. Come to think of it. Yeah, good point.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So are there any other questions or remarks, or so if there are not, let us help thank Professor Dillon once again for, okay, so I'm sorry, there is a question which I almost missed. Wehan Coops, if I'm reading it.
Your question there, yeah.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for the talk, Professor Dillon, and thank you to the hosts. Just a quick question. So you mentioned Plotinus and Porphyry being somewhat coy or secretive about the spiritual practices that might facilitate these states. Are there any clues as to why the reason for the secrecy or esotericism, as it were? I'm quite curious about whether there's anything we can say about that, or whether we can just guess at it.
Well, yes, one might well ask, why should there be any embarrassment? And yet, when Porphyry composed the life, now whatever about putting together Plotinus' works, I mean, I think in the case of Plotinus, the matter doesn't arise because he didn't feel he had to explain himself in the treatises. But Porphyry would, by that time, I think, have already attacked Iamblichus, his former pupil, for theurgic superstitions and practices. And say in later times, there came to be quite a strong distinction between pure philosophy and theurgical goings-on, theurgic practices. And so I think Porphyry, in composing the life, would not wish to dwell on anything that looked faintly like theurgy, which this isn't. This is sort of assisting the process by some meditative practices. But I think he'd be less inclined to dwell on things like that in view of perhaps his dispute with the Iamblichus. However that started, an interesting thing is he started with the letter to Anibal. How this, the background to the whole thing is obscure, but Iamblichus's treatise is a response. So he obviously thought that his former pupil was, well, dragging things down a bit or getting probably too close to sacramental theology, Christianity or something. But in view of that, perhaps he would not wish to dwell in detail on these things. But I wouldn't want to accuse him of covering things up. He just doesn't feel it necessary to say anything much. But unlike many, I mean, Eastern traditions, I think of Tibetan Buddhism and so on, I mean, there's a great deal of detailed description of how you should proceed. And in Platonism, even in later Platonism, there isn't any. I mean, Marinus suggests that Proclus indulged in the various processes and exercises, but he's not going to specify very much. We're meant to know.
So you see it more as kind of a casual passing over, not feeling it necessary, than a deliberate esotericism.
I think so. He sort of, there's certainly, I mean, I often think there's so many things in Plotinus's Porphyry's life that one would like to know, but we're meant to know that. We're meant to know how the school ran. He doesn't bother to tell us that sort of thing. We're not going to be told, above all, about the economics of everything. How the hell did everyone put food on the table? I'm sure the lady Gemina was great help, but that sort of thing one doesn't talk about. So I think I've on occasion I identified the gaps in Porphyry's life, things he doesn't know, things he's embarrassed about. That's to say, even his supplanting of Emilius and things like that, and things he expects us to know. And those three things we're not going to learn about. So, but that's a suggestion.
All right, thank you.
Oh, yes, Professor Dillon, thank you very much for your talk. I hope you can hear me all right. My question has to do with the Plotinus description of the vision of the intelligible world as an intuition by which error is not a possibility.
Sorry, it's all a bit blurred.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. Okay, thank you. Plotinus describes the vision of the intelligible world as an intuition by which error is not possible. And I'm curious if, in your view, there's a risk of losing that aspect if we start drawing ties to full physiological explanations and accounts by epilepsy and things of the sort. I'd like to hear your view.
Sorry, that sounded good, but there's still this awful echo. I just couldn't get what you were saying.
It's the aspect of.
It started again. What we to do?
Plotinus describes the vision of the intelligible world as an intuition by which error is not possible. There's no possibility of error. And I'm wondering if there's a risk of losing that when we start drawing ties to epilepsy and other physiological explanations.
Yes,
I'd like
that's a reasonable point. I mean, that's why I introduced my talk as somewhat outrageous, the way it started. But all I wanted to suggest was that that these visions have a physical basis in the human mind, or some human minds, without wanting to suggest that there is any question of this being a mental disease or something, or wanting to throw doubt on the reality of what people are experiencing. But what concerned me, or what actually Dennis Clark and others were raising, is the whole issue of the sort of personality, or the sort of brain power that actually produces religious intuitions in the first place. The idea that there is another world, the idea that there is a divinity which guides us and so on. And is this some sort of disease, or is it a breakthrough that most of us don't get to have? And I think it is the latter, but that it could be connected. And I don't know. I mean, the trouble is you have to collect some mystics and examine their brains and put them through some tests, and that's not easily done, it would seem, and it would be well a bit intrusive and a bit insulting unless everyone agreed. So the suggestion is that some people in some mental states can have experiences which they themselves don't necessarily understand, which are akin to experiences which a natural mystic can have, the natural mystic having a much better idea of what's going on. And in Plotinus' case, where all this started, I think it goes back to his youth in Alexandria, certainly, where he something drove him to come into Alexandria from the family estates to study philosophy. And he went to the obvious lecturers in philosophy, and he found them extremely boring, or not very stimulating at all. And somebody marked his card who knew what was in his mind. And so I think if you try this chap, Ammonius, you will find what you want. So there was another aspect that he was missing in ordinary philosophical lectures. And I think that perhaps relates to my quotation of Evelyn Underhill at the end, that technical philosophers, I suppose, are not going to understand this sort of thing, and are not going to have much patience with it. But that's too bad about them. That's the dangerous aspect, or the troublesome aspect about raising the question as to whether a natural mystic is someone with a particular brain condition. Because after all, the brain has to have some role in the story, even if you're totally left your body unassended. Something is sort of driving the van, so to speak. Anyway, so that answers anything.
Thank you very much.
Well, I apologize, but we are having a storm here, and this means that the connection can be problematic.
Okay.
I don't know if there are more questions, because I was away for a while.
No, I think that was perhaps the last one.
That was the last one. Okay, so apologizing once again for the interruption. Let us thank Professor Dillon for this great talk and for the very interesting discussion. Thank you very much. And let me also renew our appointment for the 12th of April. This will be our next meeting, and it will be a talk by Professor Mark Edwards on Plotinus and the Gnostics. I hope to see you all there. So thank you again. Thank you, Professor Dillon. And looking forward to our next meeting.